Okay, so they call this the twofer. Admittedly, probably not the best thing for the algorithm. Notably, it just completely ruins all of your videos for the day, but I wanted to make 2 videos today talking about all of the interview stuff. Basically, Wowhead had an exclusive interview with Ian Hazzikostas and Morgan Day, and the first part of the interview almost focused exclusively on M+. Now we have basically the full interview transcribed, created by Squishy. I'm going to cover all the things that I didn't cover specifically in that M+ interview and kind of talk through the rest of the game state stuff that Ian and Morgan talked about in that interview. If you want to listen to me talk about just the M+ stuff, about how I think that is just like awesome, I think that is just fantastic to know that high-end players are getting content that's catered to them, go watch my previous video. If you want to hear my thoughts on all the other stuff that we're going to be paying attention to inside of this new interview, let's take a look. This is what you're here for. Okay, so first and foremost, what are the goal of private orders in the War Within? Do you think the macro solution is a good thing for players to work around them? Private orders is really bad. I think that most players, Mythic Raiders, would tend to agree that private auras. I understand where Blizzard's coming from, but then they're trying to make players not, feel obligated to use weak auras for some mechanics. But from Blizzard's perspective, they just continue to design mechanics and raids too difficult sometimes, where weak auras are going to be required, particularly for assignment style things that happen too fast to where you're not going to be able to YOLO it. And so the workaround is then it's going to be like somebody using a macro or invisible chat rooms or something like that to instead then assign it and use it as like a workaround on the thing. Basically what Ian says is we developed this new tool in Dragonfly as a part of our efforts towards our philosophical goal of wanting to limit the computational power of add-ons and reestablish more room in encounters for players to coordinate and communicate. This also allows us to give them more time to react and process mechanics as opposed to unavoidably having to tune around a world where add-ons can solve a problem for players. And we know that heroic and mythic difficulty players will rely on add-ons, so private auras were a new tool that we developed to put certain buffs and debuffs out of the reach of add-ons. Though using that tool, we've been guided with the feedback from the community that it's good, but it's not... what it's good at is not... Hold on, what does this say? We've been guided by the feedback from the community. We've determined what it's good at and what it's not so good at. Okay, I can't read. And I think that there are plenty applications of private auras over the last couple of tiers that were pretty innocuous. I would agree with that. They were just debuffs that required immediate reaction from players that you were handling on your own, and that, or a couple of people running around the raid with something that people would just watch for and handle accordingly. However, what we've seen is that whenever we try to use private auras to apply raid-wide coordination mechanics, where the entire raid need to solve the problem together, and the rewards effectively doing so are more significant, players will find cumbersome workarounds involving creating manual macros that they can communicate that information with the add-on to solve the problem for them. So I think we approached the War Within with a desire to refine our continued use of the tool to steer clear of applying it in areas that we know are going to cause more annoying and frustrating behavior. I think this comes down to like Blizzard applying it in the correct spots. I think that Adrianus made a great tweet over, a couple weeks ago talking about how there were basically zero mechanics that became better because a private aura was applied to it. And so then that's a question of how is this supposed to be handled? What mechanics is this realistically supposed to be applied to? I think as long as they approach this with really good caution and good understanding of how players are going to try to handle mechanics, I think that private auras can be okay. I think that there's zero mechanics that they've applied private aura to that I'm like, wow, this mechanic got better because of it. What it boils down to is to reclaim some design space. I guess that, this makes sense from a developer. Like a developer would say something like that. There's a lot of fun mechanics or interesting design elements that would be really hard to do nowadays, and we're reflecting on this, and then we're discussing this problem internally a lot, and so there's a lot of boss encounters that have a lot of swirlies on the ground, and you just you have to dodge or take a huge step back. I think you can say a lot of this is because the design space add-ons hasn't solved it yet. You just have some amount of personal responsibility where you can dodge a mechanic. That's become more of a baseline. If you take a step back and look at older bosses, that was like almost like an archetype. A patchwork was an archetype to dodge a lot of swirls, could be used as an archetype. That's kind of where we want to start now. Add layers of interest on top of that. Yeah, and so then, the raid-wide coordination check is like now an archetype, but the raid-wide coordination check is typically something that's solved by an add-on because it's too hard to do otherwise. And then limiting add-ons or requiring some weird workaround is obviously just not the greatest thing ever. Mythic Mirror Soul is probably one of the hardest raids ever created in WoW. Many players felt the raid was tuned for the race to roll first, but never really nerfed reasonable levels for the majority of the player base. How does the team feel about Mythic Immature Cell? There were a couple of misses. We can all agree that the spike in difficulty going from Smolderon to Tendril was too great. Nerfs. We prefer a smoother ramp in difficulty that sets the players up with each boss being something that we feel like is a manageable step up over the next one. I mean, I think that this is... I mean, they say this sometimes whenever the raid's too hard. I feel like this is not an atypical reaction from... the other piece of that is the timing of the nerfs. The reality is that there's no secret across the Mythic player base that you're looking at the range from Race to World First competitors to the mere Hall of Fame guilds. Yeah, like, dude, the range from Race to World First raiders to Hall of Fame guilds to average cutting edge raiders is a just chasm. It is a huge distinction, arguably as large as it is from heroic to a Mythic raid guild, right? There's an incredible range of skill, of coordination and skill, frankly, in the game that we're trying to deliver a satisfying progression experience for all those groups. Because, yeah, there's a lot of people who complete raid. And some amount of nerfing is going to be required to achieve that. I agree. We probably could have been more aggressive with a couple of them to drop them sooner. We do need to be mindful. Yeah, it always feels really unsatisfying if your boss has to get nerfed. But what's a worse feeling is like knowing that a boss isn't killable by you and you're having to sit there and wait for a boss to get nerfed. Like Halandris was that for me. That was like really unsatisfying. They just want to make it a bit more consistent, but they didn't want that to suddenly undermine all the effort. Yeah, exactly. Ultimately, Tendril, that kind of reminds me of Tumus Argyros for Fallen Avatar, was almost felt like an end boss. Yes. I think there were probably some of those really big swings that we took later on that we could have moved up, where we might have made adjustments like the double soak. At the end of the point was where we got really good for the broader audience. Dude, you know what's funny? I have like a story about this. I had 550 pulls on Kill Jade, and we were not close to killing that boss. We would have probably taken 700 or 800 pulls to kill that boss. And then that boss got nerfed, and we killed that boss 10 pulls later, and that was so unsatisfying. I've never felt worse about a boss ever. Because it's just, I mean, that stuff is just so unfun. But, like, yeah, they just really have to be really in tune with this thing. And I think it's actually pretty noble of Blizzard to want to do it the right way, where they want to have everybody to have this progression experience. But you can't leave raid-wide pass-fail mechanics for average cutting-edge guilds that they're gonna suck at for an entire month or for a while. Many guilds reach the maximum item level due to the upgrade system before getting the final boss. Thus, there was no power gained to overgear bosses, making farm very difficult. And on the level of progression outside of nerfs, are there any plans to adjust this to allow guilds to significantly overgear bosses further on in the season? So we talked about this on the podcast with Dobie before the podcast concluded, and basically this has to do with, one, the item upgrade system, and two, end of dungeon rewards for Mythic Plus, where players are stepping in the raid at a higher item level than they ever have been in the past, and then you're like not getting as much of an upgrade before the end of the tier, and very rarely are you actually re-clearing. I remember for the longest time, people would always ask, when do you extend your lockout? And the answer for a long time was you never extend your lockout. Reclear is too valuable. But over the course of entire expansion of Dragonflight, I extended my lockout every single tier that I rated. Whenever you're doing Mythic, you would literally just extend your lockout permanently because you're not getting enough of a gear upgrade to warrant having to spend that time reclearing. Especially if you have a boss like Tendril Sage Swift, like, oh my god. Okay, so let's see what the resolution is, because I actually think that I could see a pretty big one is like, changing how gear works in raid. I've seen that where it's been like compared to PvP gearing system, where if you're wearing you're wearing raid gear inside of raid, you actually get some item level. But I think there's other solutions that they could go with. Item level progression is something that we continue to talk about a ton. It's important to that people across all playstyles feel like they have meaningful rewards to progress their characters. We don't want to string that out too much, so it feels like rewards are few and far between early on, but at the same time, I think there needs to be some meaningful goals to pursue as the season runs for more players. I think the season of the new expansion... I think the first season of the new expansion kind of always has a pretty significant gear curve. Yeah, I mean, that's just true, because you start so poverty geared. At the same time, we recognize that the raid progression itself has a life, an arc of its own, apart from the rest of the game. Yeah, because like your prog is independent of, everybody's prog is unique. So some people could be progging 3 months in the tier, where some people were done second week or something like that. Their guild's going to be progressing over the course of the season to feel like it's not just Blizzard nerfing content to bring it within reach, but they also need to be gaining power, which they weren't. There are a couple of ideas we're exploring in that space, which we could hope to roll out in the first season we're within. This is good. There's a really fantastic forum post about this a few months back from a pretty prolific Mythic guild. I think this is the Adobe post, where their guild leader made this great forum post that we ended up talking about that post at length. And the major point of the feeling like the progression, being the feeling of progression, like Ian mentioned, ultimately we want that. We want items to feel like they're nerfing the raid over time, but as we discussed, especially when it comes to Mythic raids, there's just like multiple audiences. 3 different audiences that experience Mythic at different times. Yeah, I think I think Morgan's actually spot on. I think you could argue there's 3, there's 4, there's like a bunch of different types of Mythic raiders. Ian alluded to it, but I'll talk about it a bit more. We're discussing introducing a system that has a similar vibes to the re-origination array back in Uldir, the first tier BFA, except we'll be leveraging the quest system. It'll buff players over time, and right now we're looking at capping out the buff at about 20% increased player power while you're within the raid. And that'll also apply to your warband. Oh my god, wow, that's really good. That'll be cool, and that'll be something that will come later on with your alts, and they can have the extra player power for everyone across your account. Depending on how it's received and how well that achieves our goals, we'll look to expand that system. Gut reaction, I'm a big fan. I think that Blizzard needs to really be in tune with where this player power is coming from. So 20% increase in player power. It should not just be damage and healing. There should also be a stamina component attached to it. And I think that Blizzard likes to do these pass-fail mechanics sometimes, but I think really well-designed pass-fail mechanics, too, could be ones that whenever you have 0 stacks of this re-origination array, they one-shot you. But whenever you have up to 20% player power, it's like not a one-hit. Kind of like Hazzikostas from the first tier of Dragonflight. Whenever you would have the circle on you, whenever you were like pretty undergeared, if you didn't press a large defensive, you would actually get one shot. But whenever you get this 20% increase in player power, assuming that it also increases like your stamina and stuff like that, it could actually stop one-shotting you too. And so that could actually nerf these pass-fail mechanics inherently as well. And I actually think this is a smart way of doing it. I think that it maybe there's still an issue of like gear from raid wouldn't feel super satisfying, but I guess depending on how like the quest is done, if it's like based on bosses during reclear, it's actually valuable to reclear again. I think this is good. I think it's kind of been unfortunate where, you know, the gearing system hasn't been super hot over the course of the entire expansion, where the gearing system is the best it's ever has been, but for raiders it's actually challenging. M+, so I already covered that. Again, if you want to listen to me yap about Mythic Plus, go watch my most recent video. Classes in combat. With removal of melee range, increased melee range in the war within, are there any plans to change how bosses can parry melee abilities? No. Is basically the answer. There's always big raid bosses that are standing on the ledge. In some cases, we could easily disable parry if it's like going to be what's your positioning. But we're not looking to change the core fundamentals of how creatures in WoW will work. I think a lot of melee players are going to disagree. I think that, you know, melee players feel like parry kind of similar to threat, very unsatisfying mechanic. Whenever it's dealt with properly, your thoughts are like, yeah, this is how it should be. But whenever it's dealt with incorrectly, you're just like in pure despair. You know, the long arms thing, I think the long arms thing is more of like a VFX issue where it's actually, there's a lot of clutter and there's a lot of ground mechanics and there's a lot of stuff going on. And so having that extra range makes it a lot easier to be able to pilot your character effectively. But the parry question, you know, I don't know. I don't play a lot of melee, so I don't feel so strongly on this, but I do understand from a melee perspective how it's kind of obnoxious if you ever get parried. Like, dude, you get your Vendetta parried and it's just completely over. You get your Warbreaker parried and or Colossus Smash or whatever you want to call it, and it's just completely over. We're just out of there. Raid buffs. Incentivize class diversity and the feeling of being more powerful whenever you are in a group. We've seen more classes get raid buffs in Dragonflight with Paladin getting a second, Hunter getting Hunter's Mark, just leaving DK and Shaman. Is there a reason that these classes don't be anything specific to the raid? I actually talked with Ian about this at BlizzCon, talking about raid buffs specifically. And he basically stated, and he's right about this, he basically stated that raid buffs are designed to continue to create a diverse composition inside of the raid, right? Where everybody feels like they're at least bringing something whenever you're bringing the first copy of that character, which is true. My personal thoughts, I think in general, they maybe should be looking to consolidate the raid buffs and have every class bring, like 2 classes bring 1 raid buff and have half as many raid buffs, and every class has a raid buff. Alternatively, I think they might have been right after Warlords of Draenor, where just delete the raid buffs. I mean, that was also fine, but I think that they're a bit hesitant because they don't want to see people class stacking like 6 or 7 of the same class in raids, so they'd rather have the raid buffs. But I'm interested in seeing, because yeah, like DK and Shaman, it's not even an issue of like, there's like a spot for everybody in the raid, except for these people that don't have a raid buff, which there's not a spot for you, except for, you know, there's only like 3 to 5 spots, depending on the tier, that might be available for you. Ultimately, our goal is broad spec representation and class representation across the different roles. I think we're still hesitant to add more raid buffs that might risk feeling redundant, and yet another thing to manage that might be too heavily enforced, less choice in composition forming. I feel like that. See, that's kind of where I'm at right now. I already feel like that's true. We're like, if you have your lifelong Demon Hunter retire, you're like, somebody has to re-roll to Demon Hunter, or you have to recruit a new Demon Hunter. Like, you're not picking up something new. But that's from a mythic perspective, right? Ideally, if you're a pug leader, if you're putting a mythic, if you're putting a raid or mythic raid group, you should want one of every class, and then once you have that covered, you should be looking at who's available. Yeah, I mean, like, but that's not true for DK and Shaman. We need to look at diversity and make sure that classes like Shaman and Death Knight are bringing tools to the raid that make them valued members of raid group or valued in dungeon groups. And that's not to completely close the door on a new raid buff coming to them, but our hope continues to be that the other knobs of the team has at its disposal to get them to the place where they feel equally valued. Okay, it's not like Shaman and DK don't have tools, right? Like, Shaman has Windrush Totem. You know, they have, you know, APT can be valuable in some situations from Restoration. Shaman Spirit Link can be very good in some situations as well. DK has Grip, which I would describe as once or twice a tier, a Death Knight is almost required for a fight on Mythic because Grip is so valuable. But the difference is, you know, those things are very good or required on specific fights, where Mark of the Wild, for example, is required on every single fight. And that's maybe the discrepancy that I would state. Is like, you know, the DK does have tools, right? It has Battle Risk, which is a very important tool for Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus is a little bit different because, you know, 5% damage in Mythic Plus is a lot different than 5% damage in Raid. Just because you're only doing, instead of doing 30% of your group's damage in Mythic Plus, or whatever, 25% of your group's damage in Mythic Plus, instead you're doing 7% or 6% or 5%, whatever. I don't know. It's tough. I don't agree. I think that in general, I think it's noble that they want diversity in regards to the raid buffs. I think that from like a player experience perspective, not in love with this. When class balance is an important aspect of the game to many players, what do you look for when deciding how to balance classes and when? We touched on this briefly as we're discussing raid and raid adjustments. Try to create a pretty consistent cadence for when our combat team looks at balance. Yeah, I mean, which I think that's actually true. I just don't think it's fast enough for what players' desires necessarily are, and it's rarely as heavy-handed or all-encompassing as players would like. Everybody wants their class to be buffed. That's just just know that everybody wants their personal class to be buffed. I feel like that was very effective in Dragonflight. In terms of what we look for, we often talk about, not too dissimilar from what Ian was talking about, different strengths and weaknesses for classes. We'll often ask, if we can wave a magic wand, what should this look like? Whether we're looking at a specific encounter, what should the damage meter look like? What should the healing meter look like? Who should be winning this and why? High-level philosophies. I think raid tuning has typically been fairly okay, especially across all of Dragonflight. I think that AoE damage tuning, and especially the variables that are encompassed in Mythic Plus tuning specifically, has been something that's a bit rough, especially since we had God Comp into Season 4 tuning, where classes are pretty imbalanced. And it's not that we even know that Blizzard doesn't know what to do about it, it's just that Blizzard didn't do anything about it, effectively. And I understand that Blizzard, you know, they've stated in interviews in the past that they don't want to be heavy-handed with tuning, but at the same point, it's like, if there was something that was maybe a bit more regular tuning, maybe something a bit more heavy-handed, if you never felt like... basically, there's never going to be tuning that is meta-defining after a patch just went live. They're very hesitant to disrupt the flow of the meta because players are very attached to their specific class. So I get it, but at the same point, having a really good meta like we did in like Season 1 of Dragonflight for Mythic Plus is sick. And, you know, if you could actually create a meta game for M Plus that is kind of similar to what the raid metagame is, where you can kind of play a bunch of different stuff. You know, there's going to be some stuff that's better, of course. There's always going to be a meta, but like if you can play a bunch of different permutations or options, That's the greatest feeling. So, I mean, I think it's just going to like come down to if they could get more consistent tuning, even if we could get, I don't know, they balanced that League of Legends game. That Riot Games, those Riot Games people balance that shitty League of Legends game. So, like, surely Blizzard can balance their classes. Hero talents are one of the premier features of War Within. Some specs having fairly stunning visuals. Some of them are a bit more subdued. Will we see additional visuals? Should we see more hero spec integration visuals and cosmetics and War Within, like something like tier sets? Oh my gosh, that's kind of cool. Okay, that's a super interesting idea. I'll talk about the first part. Hero talents are evergreen addition to World of Warcraft. It's the same as we might revisit some existing class spells to bring them up to modern standards. We totally plan to revisit hero talents, some additional polish in future War Within patches. Oh, okay. So it's something that could be on the table. Yeah. Dude, I think like Diabolist Warlock is like the coolest shit ever. Like visually stunning. And then, you know, Moonkin I don't think is like something that's insane. But like, you know. Yeah. I think that cooler visuals make abilities feel a lot more satisfying. We saw some late expansion changes to healers in Dragonflight, and healing has been mentioned as being a problem. What are the design goals of healers in the War Within to further address issues and to make healing more fun role in WoW? I would say that the biggest issue for healers that they face is defensive creep. Oh, which looks like it's asked here. Okay, so I'll read this thing about healers. Healing continues to be a major topic among the combat team and the encounter team. Dude, healing is so hard to address. And those are the two sides of the coin here. We've taken the opportunity to do something that we weren't able to do mid-expansion during Dragonflight and rebalance the health pool size and change that to relative to incoming damage, their healing tools, their personal percentage-based heals, and so forth. So on and so forth. It's one of the paradoxes of the debate that nerfing healing sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like a thing that should make healers unhappy, but reducing the relative power of healing in this case, as players have done a great job of highlighting, has actually improved the healer gameplay. Yeah, exactly. Whenever healers are weaker, right? Whenever it takes more globals to heal up your health bar, but damage is smoother, that means that the healer effectively is going to have more agency. There's going to allow more triage and decision making as to where your healing is going, as opposed to a world where players can top others off with a single GCD, where the only way to threaten players is by instantly killing them, basically one-shotting them. That's something we're keeping a very close eye on. Yeah, I agree with this. They really need to. I think that, and if you played the alpha at all or the beta at all, you'll notice in the War Within, healers have a lot of time. Like, it takes a long time to top people up now. I think the team is just in the process of looking at Leech as a stat and making adjustments to the throughput it delivers. Yo, look at avoidance too, please. Because that's often just the passive self-healing that people are bringing to an encounter that makes the encounter design have to add unavoidable pulsing damage to offset it. At which point, let's just take a step back and mutually disarm here and let healers be again in the spotlight. I agree. I think that healer as a role has had probably too little of agency for a little bit. Looking at Classic, the pace of healing and how healing is paced out different eras of the game. At the end of the day, we want healers to be responsible for the health and the well-being of their parties. Assuming the tank is keeping things under control, but not overly stressed in doing so, they should feel powerful in their ability to save and correct the mistakes that the group has made. But also that they're not spinning so many plates at any given time that making a single mistake or take a breath for a single second that something is going to collapse. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I mean, I think that, funnily enough, I actually think that for Mythic Plus specifically, obviously this is not necessarily for Raid, but for M Plus specifically, the difference between high-end players and how they play around their healer versus like medium to low-end players and how they play around their healer is vastly different. Where high-end players like stop taking unavoidable damage at some point because you're gonna die, and unavoidable damage is just like widely known as unacceptable. And then you start pressing your personals well, and you're like rotating your defensives perfectly. And so then you start taking a lot less damage, but then the healer's obligations then become, making sure they're pressing externals at the right time, making sure that players are topped up between these one-shot hits, adding damage contribution where they can. And so it kind of creates this weird dichotomy where there's just like a large difference. But like I would say that medium to low-end level players, whenever you're playing with the healer, that healer's job is a lot more stressful than whenever they're playing like a high end or with better players rather. Many content creators have been talking about defensive creep in the game. I think defensive creep is a real problem. Oh my god, I think it's really bad. The delta between players who use defensives effectively and the players who don't seems to have gotten very large, leading to a very large delta in damage taken and survivability, sometimes even removing the need for healers altogether. Do you feel like defensive creep is real and there's any plans to do anything about it before the launch of the expansion? I think that also it's not about like players who use their defenses versus don't, although that is a problem. I think it's also the toolkits that are provided. You have some talents. Veteran of the Third War, by the way, is always my go-to example. That thing is 20% stamina, which is stronger than some classes' entire defensive kit. 20% stamina is a fuck ton, by the way. Okay, let's see what Ian and Morgan are doing. Are they going to have some plan to change defensives? Definitely real in some forms. They're talking about defensive creep. I think that objectively Dragonflight in the talent system added the ability to opt into more hybrid utility, more defensives, and self-healing tools for DPS specs that may play a part of the hybrid class in particular. This was probably true in Season 1, where a lot of the hybrids, especially with things like Vigil and AV and VE and stuff like that, were doing just a ton of healing, but then they nerfed them all. And so then they're point where they're less good. You know, VE is still very good. Like, all those abilities are still very good, but they're not polarizing in the sense that they were in Season 1. On the one hand, I think there's some cool fantasy there, underscoring the utility options that are available to a class. There's a lot of value in world content and smaller group content. Certainly delves in the world than having those tools and really being able to manage your own survivability better. At the same time, I think we're also keenly aware of the pressure that places on encounter design and on healing at the very high end, where we need to assume the players are making use of all of the tools available to them. There's a point where having a defensive means that the encounter designers have to hit you harder to assume that you're using the defensive, and having defensive isn't necessarily making your life easier or better as a player. And in some ways, it becomes a little bit of a tax. Yeah, I mean, that's because like there's a difference between damage smoothing and using a defensive to prevent from one-shots, right? Where whenever you're trying to smooth damage, you're using a defensive to mitigate. And so like whenever something hits you for 40% of your health, you use a 20% DR, you know, you're just going to take less healing to get topped back up. You know, your healer's going to have more globals to do whatever healers do. Whereas if you're getting one shot, it's either press defensive or die, and you don't really have any agency, right, over your defensives. And like being smart about your defensives is like hard to teach to a lot of players. So I think we're not in a position where we're going to go through and rip out a whole bunch of abilities for the War Within in the coming weeks. But I think we are going to look at what an ongoing disarmament might look like. I think it's important that all players have some outs to situations, tools that they can use, but they shouldn't have so many that we're assuming that one is always up. They shouldn't be so potent or so frequently available that they're overshadowing the contributions of a healer to keep you alive in a group setting. Yeah, I mean, I agree, but like, dude, they're adding more. Every single hero, for those who don't know, every single hero talent has some defensive value in it as well, which, I mean, it doesn't solve this, right? It makes it even harder, right? Where you're going to be more required to press a defensive or die, especially if your healers are weaker, which healers can, like, healers being weaker is good if one shots aren't a thing, but healers being weak is really bad if one shots are a thing, and then your healer can't get you topped. I wonder what Morgan says. Another area we're looking at here is, I actually think there's a bit of an outsized impact is actually augmentation and Myth Plus in particular. Okay, what? We're looking at a lot of their representation of raids and their damage contributions, and it's significant, but it doesn't feel outsized compared to the survivability benefits that they bring, especially in smaller group sizes. It's really significant to the point where it might take something that could otherwise be unmanageable by a group, even a group that's using their defensives really effectively, couldn't do that, but with an extra bump from the AUG, they can. So that's another area that the team has been looking pretty closely at. That's a space where we'll look into and maybe make some adjustments for the launch of War Within. Okay. I agree with what they said about AUG. I don't love this. I think that power creep in the game. This might be some unrelatable shit where it's just like a top end player thing. So I'm sorry if this comes off as really unrelatable, but like, dude, it is so hard. Whenever you're having to really micro your defensives in like a perfect manner, and getting one shot 100 to 0 feels so unsatisfying. And it started happening in Raid too, where it's like the first tier of Dragonflight, Razageth, the first time we pulled Razageth, I just randomly got one shot by this bomb. And it's like, oh, I guess I have to press Bark Skin or die, which is like not common for like a raid mechanic in general. Like if you go and look back, Sludge Fist World First. If you go and look back at like Sludge Fist World First, like look at how much of their health is moving per second here, right? They're taking damage, and and basically nobody's getting topped here, but they're not getting hit 100 to 0 like the Razgeth hits are. And I think that, you know, whenever you're pressing a defensive to smooth the amount of damage you're taking by 20%, like in that clip, as opposed to getting one shot, you know, it's just a very different situation. I think that I would have been more on the ball with it. I knew that this wasn't happening. Like basically from what we've seen from hero talents and stuff like that, I knew that a disarmament wasn't coming. Hopefully it's something that they look at for next expansion. That is definitely a next expansion thing, which is unfortunate because I think it's, for players like me, a pretty dire thing. It's pretty annoying. Mid-expansion release of a new spec was certainly a first. How successful was the addition of augmentation to the WoW landscape? Dude, I saw a tweet by JB. He was like, it's funny that they classify augmentation as a success, yet they didn't make any more support specs. We remain happy with the experiment of trying to reintroduce a very support-style damage dealer to the vein of what Shadow Priest or Enhancement or Ret were in WoW 15 years ago. Where a huge portion of our contribution was amping the capabilities of people around you. Yeah, because there were like seals and stuff like that. I actually didn't start playing until WoD, so I don't really know anything about this. Like I've read about it. I think reined in augmentation a couple times, and our goal is for them to see representation comparable to other damage dealers. Yeah. I like playing Aug. I think that Aug is actually really cool. I think the issue with Aug is like, in raid, it's like a homework spec where you have to actually do so much research in advance. I wouldn't have minded more support specs personally. I think that in WoW, it feels really awkward. AUG just in general feels very awkward. And it's a balancing nightmare. I will say, though, that I did have a lot of fun playing it in Mythic Plus. I've had a lot of fun playing it in Mythic Plus on the beta as well. I think that for balancing concerns, it's incredibly problematic, though. Especially, too, since you actually can't see their actual contribution. Being able to look at the damage numbers and just, like, not knowing what's real and what's not, and, you know, the combat logs being completely broken with them and, like, their log hooks being completely broken, I think is maybe a bit of a mistake. I think if Blizzard went with something that's a bit more simple, like it's either flat gain or it's damage procs. Like, if you have Ebb and Might on you, you're, like, constantly procking damage out of your character based on spells sent or something like that. You know, it's a little bit easier to see. In general, I think that, you know, this is just a question for Blizzard. They're not deleting it, though. So for people who want it deleted, just know that they're not deleting it. How do you feel like reduced range for Evokers played out in practice? I hate playing with it as Prez. Whenever I hate playing with a Preservation Evoker because of this. Sorry. Whenever I've played Dev and Aug, I've been okay with the playstyle. I actually haven't had too many problems. But that's because as a damage dealer, you have so much room to kind of do your own thing. Whereas Prez being reliant on the rest of your group being stacked is miserable. Mostly because I'm a monkey. And I'm sure that can't feel satisfying for the healers who are like, what is this monkey DPS doing standing 20 yards away from me or 35 yards away from me? I can't heal you, moron. Like, I'm sure that's what's going through their head. I know the team was recently discussing this as a hot button topic, and ultimately this gets back to what we're discussing about creating unique strengths and weaknesses. But, you know, their stacked healing is really strong, but, like, Prez, like, sucks. It's just, like, not fun. And ultimately, we're pretty happy with where this landed. I always like to point out to the team that if the reduced range feels like a significant detriment to the class, let's make sure that the strengths counterbalance that. Let's make sure that for when there is an area where a little bit clumped on the fight space, or it's a little bit more close quarters, they really shine in those circumstances. Yeah, I mean, that's true. Like, their stack healing is really good, like Prez specifically. It just kind of not very fun to play with. It's kind of like if you were permanently trapped inside the Resto Druid's Efflorescence. It's like that. If you were permanently trapped inside the Resto Druid's Efflo. Some specs still seem to still be reeling from the AoE cap. Tuning in BFA, especially on large pulls, or any plans to like the AoE cap with all the specs again. Yeah, so that's like what, Warrior, Windwalker, Monk, Rogue, all still pretty annoyed with the AoE cap, you know. No current plans overall. We're still continuing to tune the specs against one another to the representation. Oh, Hunter. To the representation against one another, understanding that in dungeons in particular in the high end, pull sizes trend towards that upper end of the spectrum, and that can cause balance issues. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, he's probably right. It's like probably just like a me thing, right? Where I see like these 20 mob pulls, and I'm just like, yeah, dude, Windwalker can't be good in this. I just watched them do the first pull of Alga Cat. I mean, they're getting beat by this uncapped tank. If loosening or recalculating how AoE caps work for specific specs ends up being the right way to address some of those imbalances, that's a decision the team is going to make. But I think from a philosophical top-down perspective, the way we're looking at it from our positions, we're not even looking to overhaul the way that works across all of WoW. It's a more surgical spec-by-spec basis. I don't agree, but I understand what they're saying. I think that M+ is just like such a prominent part of the game. It's really, really hard to balance. I think that balancing AoE is just incredibly challenging as a whole. And whenever you have some of these specs that are just like target cap, it's going to be so hard. Visual clarity. Are there any plans to create an improved swirly graphic that gets... Swirly graphic that still signifies get out but has a clear border that doesn't expand with the size of the swirly? Yeah, absolutely. We're looking to improve visual clarity here, and we're actually cooking up some stuff in the War Within that might not necessarily be in for the initial launch. We're looking to make improvements over time with that. I think the VFX and visual clarity on a lot of abilities and mechanics and stuff like that has been improving. I don't think it's always super clear what you're supposed to do, but I think that in general, Blizzard does like an okay job. I think the bigger issue with visual clarity is like whenever you're playing in melee, whenever you have all the mobs on top of you, then the visual clarity is a bit more challenging then. There's also something that they're adding. He doesn't talk about this here. I was reading about this. So something he doesn't talk about is there's actual like a collision mode that's in the War Within where you're able to like see your character through trees and through like walls and stuff like that. You never actually lose track of like your relative position of your character, even though you can't see it like perfectly. And I think that that's actually a pretty good thing for VFX. A lot of these about visual clarity. Oh my god. Visual distinctions between friendly AoE effects and boss AoE effects that seem to overlap often. Is there a way that you plan on making them more distinctive? Dude, I think darkness is the worst one, where it's like darkness just like randomly covers so many effects. I think taking a pass on visual language is something that we talk about a lot, and that's an active, ongoing effort to part of the team. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. A lot of the changes, unfortunately, that we're working on likely aren't going to be seen at the start of War Within, other than specific one-off mechanics. One-off raid mechanics are designed to be as redundant as possible, but to that broader solution, how does this look like something you're supposed to soak? How does this look like something you're supposed to get off? How does this look like friendly versus hostile? Yeah. Are there any other things that I'm like super interested about talking through? The expansion had a lot of large bosses, and players use dust to turn the bosses translucent. Yeah, I mean, they're going to talk about collision mode probably. Pretty cool options of the War Within. There'll be an option to highlight it if your character's behind some collision in game. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was good. Elite Mogs. I don't care anything about Elite Mogs. All right. That's basically all that I wanted to cover inside of this interview. Again, go check this out in the description below. Sorry for the double upload today. Hope you guys enjoyed the content. A lot of interesting stuff. I'm really interested to see what's going to be coming on the beta over the next couple of days. So yeah, if you like that kind of stuff on stream, looking for stream content, that kind of thing with beta, come check out my stream. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.